Hey son, it is a Tuesday morning somewhere in 1962, and the kitchen smells like black coffee and something faintly floral, the kind of scent that comes from a woman who has already done three things before you have found your shoes. She is standing at the counter in a housecoat, eating half a grapefruit with a serrated spoon, and she looks absolutely unbothered by the fact that breakfast is not pancakes. Tonight, we are stepping into something quieter than a diet plan and stranger than a magazine. We are stepping into the unspoken food rituals of women in the 1960s, the strange little habits, the peculiar staples, the things nobody called a diet because nobody needed to. The coffee is hot. The grapefruit half sits on the saucer like a small citrus moon. And everything you thought you knew about how women stayed slim before calorie-counting apps is about to get very interesting. If this is your first time here, welcome. Pull up a stool. If you have been here before, you already know how this works. Hit the like button if any of this feels familiar. Subscribe if you want more. Leave a comment and tell us what your mother or grandmother kept in that refrigerator. We read every single one. And now we are also on Spotify. The link is in the description. So you can take this with you on a walk, a drive, or a long evening of doing absolutely nothing productive. Now, before we begin, a few questions that have been keeping us up at night. Did women in 1962 actually eat, or did they just stand near food and absorb it through sheer elegance? Was cottage cheese really a meal, or was it a punishment disguised as lunch? How did a generation of women manage to stay slim without a single app, a single macro, or a single person on the internet telling them what their cortisol was doing? Was Tab soda a soft drink, or was it actually a dare in a can? What was in that Jell-O mold that nobody talks about anymore, and why did it contain vegetables? And perhaps most urgently, why did everything taste better on a plate that weighed 4 pounds? It is 1962 now. The percolator is gurgling on the counter. A woman somewhere is doing something quietly disciplined that her granddaughter would find completely bewildering. Let us start with the morning, because the morning was where it all began. Before the coffee was finished brewing, before the rest of the household had made a sound, many women in the 1960s were already at the kitchen table with half a grapefruit in front of them and a special serrated spoon in their hand. Not a regular spoon, a grapefruit spoon. Small, sharp, slightly sinister. This was not breakfast. This was a ritual. The grapefruit itself sat in a small bowl or on a saucer, sometimes with a single maraschino cherry placed in the center hollow, which was the 1960s way of saying, this is still a pleasure, even if it is also a discipline. The flesh was cold from the refrigerator. The smell when you cut into it was sharp and clean, a smell that cleared the head the way nothing else quite did at 6:45 in the morning. Some women sprinkled a small amount of sugar over the top. Some did not, and considered the ones who did to be operating under a slight moral compromise they were too polite to mention. The grapefruit diet, in one form or another, had been circulating since the 1930s, when a version of it called the Hollywood diet promised that something in the grapefruit, an enzyme, a compound, a general attitude, would help the body burn fat faster than it otherwise might. The science was questionable. The devotion was not. By the 1960s, half a grapefruit before breakfast, or as breakfast was so standard that it barely registered as a diet choice. It was simply what you did in the morning if you were a woman paying attention to herself. There is something worth sitting with in that phrase. Paying attention, not punishing yourself, not logging anything, not setting a timer or consulting an app or photographing the bowl. Just noticing what you put into your body at the start of the day, before the noise of the household began. The grapefruit was the first act of self-governance in a day that was going to ask a great deal of you. It was sour and clarifying and over in 4 minutes, and then you moved on. The refrigerator in many 1960s homes had a dedicated drawer for citrus, the way it has a dedicated drawer for vegetables now. A bag of grapefruit was a pantry staple the way protein bars are a pantry staple today, except that a grapefruit had the decency not to taste like chalk wrapped in ambition. They were cheap, widely available, and took no preparation beyond having and perhaps the most minimal of sugar dustings. There was an efficiency to this that the era appreciated. If you grew up in a household like this, you remember the sound of that spoon against the rind, the way you worked around the sections methodically, the slight resistance, and then the give. You remember the juice that ran down the side of your hand if you were not careful, the sharp smell that lingered on your fingers afterward. You remember your mother eating hers standing at the counter or seated at the kitchen table in the quiet before the house woke up, moving through the ritual with the focused calm of someone who had decided something about herself a long time ago and saw no reason to revisit the decision. Modern life has given us smoothies and protein shakes and entire meal replacement industries built around the premise that breakfast is a problem to be solved. The women of the 1960s did not feel that breakfast was a problem. They felt it was a starting point, and for a great many of them, that starting point was cold, sharp, and served in a small bowl with a serrated spoon. It was enough. It was exactly enough. It is 7 in the morning, and the percolator is doing its work on the stovetop. The smell moves through the whole house like it owns the place. Dark, slightly bitter, impossibly reassuring. In the 1960s, black coffee was not just a morning drink. For a certain kind of woman, it was the first meal of the day, consumed standing at the counter in a housecoat, with the particular focused expression of someone who has already decided what the day is going to look like. The percolator was a specific kind of machine. It was loud, confident, and completely uninterested in producing anything subtle. The coffee it made was strong in the way that strong things were strong in the 1960s, unapologetically, without foam or flavor notes or a small card explaining the elevation at which the beans were grown. It was coffee. You poured it into a cup that was heavy and ceramic and had probably been in the house since the wedding. You did not add much to it, if anything at all. Black coffee, in the nutritional understanding of the 1960s, was essentially calorie-free, and women knew this with the quiet certainty of people who had read enough magazine columns to have assembled a working personal science of eating. A cup of black coffee in the morning was not just a drink, it was a tool. It suppressed appetite in the early hours, provided something warm and purposeful to hold, and gave the morning a shape before the shape of the day became apparent. There were women who drank 2 cups before eating anything. There were women who drank coffee through the entire morning and considered lunch their first real meal. Neither of these things was considered extreme. Neither attracted comment. The idea that you needed to eat within 30 minutes of waking, that your metabolism was a fragile thing requiring immediate stoking, had not arrived yet. The body in the 1960s understanding was more patient than that. It could wait. It had things to do. The coffee ritual extended through the morning in the way that rituals do when they are genuinely useful. A second cup at 9:30 perhaps, while the laundry was sorted, or a neighbor came by for a brief visit at the kitchen table. The coffee was always on. The pot was always warm. There was a communal, democratic quality to the percolator that had nothing to do with diet and everything to do with the rhythm of a household. But its role in keeping appetite quiet through the morning hours was real, and the women who relied on it knew it, even if they would not have framed it in those terms. You might look at this from the present day and want to call it restriction. You might feel the urge to worry about it, to assign it a clinical name or a modern framework. Try to resist that. In the kitchen of a 1960s home at 7 in the morning, a woman drinking black coffee was not doing something grim. She was doing something purposeful and pleasurable and faintly independent. The cup was hers. The quiet was hers. The decision about what went into the cup and what did not was hers. That kind of quiet ownership over small daily choices is one of the things the era did quietly well, even when the larger picture around it was more complicated. The percolator has been replaced now. The kitchen counter holds something sleeker, something with a screen or a capsule or a digital interface that remembers your preferences. The coffee is arguably better. The ritual, if you are lucky, is still the same. It is lunchtime now, and on the kitchen counter there is a plate that requires a moment of quiet contemplation before we proceed. At the center sits a generous scoop of cottage cheese, white and dimpled and entirely unapologetic. Around it, perhaps a few peach slices, maybe a leaf of iceberg lettuce, possibly a single cracker. This was lunch, real lunch, eaten with genuine satisfaction by women who would look at your current meal prep situation and say absolutely nothing, but mean everything. Cottage cheese in the 1960s occupied a position in the American diet that is difficult to fully appreciate from the present. It was not a health food in the niche, specialty store sense. It was simply food, widely available, inexpensive, high in protein, low in fat, and possessing a neutral quality that made it compatible with almost any companion you placed beside it. Sweet things worked. Savory things worked. A little salt and pepper worked. A dollop of it next to a salad worked. It was the most cooperative food in the refrigerator, and women of the era used it accordingly. The protein content was understood even if nobody was tracking macros on a small glowing rectangle they carried in their apron pocket. Women knew, in the practical, experiential way, that you learn things you live with, that a scoop of cottage cheese at noon kept you fuller longer than a sandwich made of white bread and a thin slice of bologna. The dairy fat was modest. The protein was substantial. The calorie count was low by the standards of any era, and it was ready in the time it took to open the container and find a clean plate. There was a specific aesthetic to the cottage cheese plate that the 1960s perfected. The canned peach halves, cool and amber sweet from the refrigerator, placed symmetrically beside the scoop. The lettuce leaf is a kind of liner, green and slightly wilted at the edges if it had been in the crisper too long. The single cracker, vertical, leaning against the cottage cheese like a small flag planted in pale, dimpled territory. This was not carelessness. This was a particular kind of presentation that said I am feeding myself properly without making a production of it. It was lunch as a statement of measured self-regard. Your mother may have eaten this. Your grandmother almost certainly did. If you grew up in a household where the refrigerator always had a round container of cottage cheese near the front of the top shelf, you already know this world. You know the specific sound the spoon made against the plastic sides of the container. You know the way it smelled, faintly dairy and clean. You know that it was never the exciting lunch, and it was never pretending to be. And somehow that honesty about its own modest nature was part of what made it satisfying. The modern world has rediscovered cottage cheese with an enthusiasm that the 1960s would find both flattering and slightly bewildering. It is now blended into smoothies, whipped into dips, stirred into pasta sauce, and photographed extensively. Women in 1963 were not whipping it into anything. They were scooping it onto a plate beside a peach half and eating it with a fork at the kitchen table in about 8 minutes, and then getting on with their afternoon. That directness, that absence of performance around the act of eating, is one of the things the era had that is genuinely hard to replicate now. The cottage cheese plate was not content. It was lunch. There is a box in the pantry. It is thin and rectangular, and the crackers inside it are so light they could technically be classified as edible paper. Melba toast. Named after a famous opera singer, eaten by millions of women who had never heard an opera in their lives, but understood instinctively that this cracker was doing something for them. It was crisp. It was satisfying in a minimal, disciplined sort of way. And it went with everything, which in 1963 meant cottage cheese, canned tuna, or a very thin slice of something. Dame Nellie Melba, the Australian soprano for whom the toast was named, had apparently required something light and easily digestible during an illness in the 1890s, and her chef, the legendarily named Auguste Escoffier of the Ritz in London, had twice baked a thin slice of bread until it was dry and crackling and impervious to becoming anything other than what it was. The result had survived, somewhat improbably, into the American kitchen of the 1960s, where it sat in its thin cardboard box between the saltines and the Ritz and occupied a specific dietary niche that no other cracker could quite fill. The appeal of Melba toast was partly textural and partly psychological. The crunch was real and satisfying in a way that made eating it feel more substantial than it was. Your teeth had something to do. The sound it made when you bit into it was audible and definitive, and somehow implied that something meaningful was happening, even if what was happening was that you were eating 32 calories worth of dried bread beside a scoop of cottage cheese. The crunch was the point. The crunch said meal. It was also, practically speaking, a delivery system for toppings that would otherwise require bread. A thin spread of cream cheese. A small amount of pimento spread from a glass jar that had been in the refrigerator since the neighbors visited. A slice of tomato with a pinch of salt. Melba toast made these things lunch rather than snacks, and the distinction mattered in a decade when the line between a proper meal and grazing was something women maintained with quiet discipline. The box lasted a long time, which was another practical virtue. Unlike bread, which staled and molded and had a short and anxious shelf life, Melba toast was already as dry as it was ever going to get. It sat in the pantry patiently and waited to be needed. There was a kind of reliability to it that fit the era. It did not ask much of you. It did not require refrigeration or freshness or attention. It was simply there when you needed something to put under something else, and it was done. If you are of a certain age, there is a good chance that the smell of Melba toast is somewhere in the catalog of your mother's kitchen. The particular dry, faintly weedy smell that drifted out when you opened the box. Not exciting, not pretending to be exciting, just present and useful and slightly dusty in the way of things that have been around long enough to stop apologizing for themselves. The cravings of the 1960s did not often include Melba toast, but the daily discipline did, and the daily discipline was doing more work than the cravings anyway. Let us be honest about something. There is a particular way that lunch gets eaten when there is no one in the house to watch. It is Tuesday. The children are at school. The husband is at work. The woman of the house opens a can of tuna with a church key opener, drains it into the sink, and eats it standing up with a fork over the counter, with perhaps a squeeze of lemon if she is feeling ambitious. No plate required, no guilt attached. This is not a sad lunch. This is a sovereign lunch. The church key opener was a tool that required a certain confident technique. You pierce the lid twice, on opposite sides, and the liquid drained cleanly into the sink, with a smell that was distinctly tuna and entirely recognizable to anyone who grew up in a kitchen that used it. The tuna itself was solid white or chunk light, packed in water or oil, and it came out of the can in a small, cohesive mound that you either ate directly from the can or transferred to a fork in pieces that were each individually adequate. Oil-packed was richer. Water-packed was lighter. Women had opinions about this, and those opinions were held with more conviction than you might expect. Canned tuna in the 1960s was not the niche health food it has since become in certain circles, nor was it the lowly pantry staple it sometimes gets dismissed as today. It was protein, fast, and inexpensive, and available on every grocery store shelf in every size. From the small 3-ounce can, meant for one, to the larger can that could become a casserole by Thursday, with the help of some cream of mushroom soup and a sleeve of crackers crumbled on top. Women of the era moved between these applications with a pragmatism that was neither glamorous nor self-pitying. It was just what you did with tuna. The over-the-sink lunch has a long and unacknowledged history in the domestic life of women who have spent all morning managing other people's meals and arrived at noon without the energy or the desire to perform the act of eating for an audience. It is eaten standing because sitting down makes it a meal that requires presentation. It is eaten over the sink because that is the most efficient location for a fork and a can. It is eaten quickly and without ceremony and with a complete and uncomplicated relationship to hunger and satiation that is, frankly, worth admiring. There may have been a squeeze of lemon. There may have been a dash of the Tabasco that lived on the second shelf of the spice rack. Some women added a small amount of mayonnaise directly into the can and mixed it with the fork, which was not a recipe so much as an understanding between themselves and the available materials. The result was not Instagram content. It was lunch. It took 4 minutes. It contained enough protein to carry you through the afternoon without the 3 o'clock collapse that a white bread sandwich would have produced. If someone had told the woman eating tuna over the sink on a Tuesday in 1963 that 40 years later people would be photographing their lunches and posting them for strangers to evaluate, she would have drained the can, dried her hands on the dish towel, and looked at you with an expression that combined polite confusion and the quiet superiority of someone who has better things to do. She would have been right. It is 1963, and a new kind of drink has arrived at the grocery store in a pink and white can that practically vibrates with optimism. Tab. The first Diet Cola aimed specifically at women, sweetened with cyclamates, and coated in a kind of cheerful marketing that suggested drinking. It was basically the same as jogging. It tasted like someone had described Coca-Cola to a scientist and asked them to approximate it using only chemicals and ambition. Women loved it anyway. The Coca-Cola Company introduced Tab in 1963 at a moment when the diet soda market was small, but the appetite for it was growing fast. The name came from the idea of keeping a tab on your caloric intake, a concept that was modern and knowing and slightly conspiratorial in the best 1960s marketing way. The can was pink before pink became a saturated marketing signal. It was slender before slender cans were a product category. It looked, on the grocery store shelf, like something that had been designed for a specific kind of woman. And it was. The sweetener was cyclamate, which was 30 times sweeter than sugar and had none of its calories. The taste was distinctive in a way that required adjustment. Tab did not taste like Coca-Cola. It tasted like Tab, which was its own category of experience. Sweet and slightly chemical, and with an aftertaste that your palate either accommodated over time or never quite forgave. Women who drank it regularly stopped noticing the aftertaste by the 3rd week. Women who drank it occasionally never quite got past it. This did not significantly affect the sales figures. What Tab offered, beyond the flavor, was permission. Permission to have something sweet, something fizzy, something that felt indulgent without the caloric consequence of the real thing. It fit into the 1960s dietary logic very cleanly. You did not have to give up pleasure. You simply had to find a thinner version of it. Tab was the thin version of pleasure, sold in a thin can, aimed at women who were navigating the cultural expectations of a decade that had decided quite definitively what the female body was supposed to look like. In 1969, cyclamates were banned in the United States after studies linked extremely high doses to cancer in laboratory rats. The doses involved were not remotely achievable through tab consumption. You would have needed to drink hundreds of cans per day. But the ban was the ban, and tab reformulated, switching eventually to saccharin, which had its own controversies and its own distinct aftertaste that also required accommodation. The brand survived all of it. Tab remained in production, beloved by a loyal following, until Coca-Cola finally discontinued it in 2020, which felt to those who drank it like the end of something more than a soda. What Tab represented in its 1960s prime was the beginning of a long American conversation about whether you could have the feeling of indulgence without the substance of it, whether sweet could be made thin, whether pleasure and discipline could occupy the same can. The answer the 1960s gave was an enthusiastic yes in pink and white, sold at the grocery store near the checkout lane, cold and fizzing and tasting approximately like what you wanted. There is no easy way to say this. In the 1960s, Jell-O was considered diet food, not the Jell-O of birthday parties and hospital trays, but a more serious Jell-O, molded in a ring pan, suspended with shredded carrots or celery or cucumber, chilled until firm, and served on a bed of lettuce as a first course or side dish. It wobbled. It was translucent. It contained a vegetable, and it was written about in women's magazines with the same reverent language we now reserve for acai bowls. The savory gelatin mold occupied a peculiar and earnest place in mid-century American cooking that requires some historical context to fully appreciate. Gelatin itself had been a luxury item in the 19th century, requiring long hours of simmering bones and straining stock, and the arrival of powdered-flavored instant gelatin in the early 20th century democratized the whole operation in a way that felt genuinely exciting. You could make something that looked complicated and set beautifully on a plate, and it took you 12 minutes and cost almost nothing. This was considered an achievement of domestic science. By the 1960s, the gelatin mold had evolved into a legitimate weight management tool. The logic was sound in a rough-hewn way. Gelatin was low in calories. Vegetables suspended in gelatin were still vegetables. The result was filling in the way that something cold and large in the stomach tends to be filling, regardless of what it actually contains. Women's magazines carried recipes with names like cucumber lime refresher mold and garden vegetable aspic that made the enterprise sound elegant rather than eccentric, which it absolutely was if you think about it for more than 30 seconds. The vegetables most commonly suspended in gelatin were the mild and crunchy variety. Shredded carrots appeared frequently, catching the light through the translucent wall of lime or lemon jello in a way that was visually striking, if not entirely appetizing. Celery appeared in slices, which created a cross-sectional pattern when the mold was cut. Cucumber was a popular choice, especially with lemon gelatin, where it gave the whole thing a cool, vaguely spa-like quality, before spas were a common reference point. Some recipes added olives, which was a decision that history has not been kind to. The ring mold shape was important. It gave the finished product a formal architectural quality that said this is a dish, not just a thing, and it allowed for a visual centerpiece, a small pile of cottage cheese perhaps, or a few lettuce leaves arranged in the hollow. The gelatin was unmolded onto a plate with a technique that involved warm water, a butter knife run around the edge, an inverted plate, and a brief committed shake that was either successful or catastrophic. When it worked, the mold settled onto the plate with a dignified wobble. When it did not work, dinner had a different shape than planned. This is all genuinely strange when viewed from the present, and yet the instinct behind it was not so different from the impulse that drives every current wellness trend. Find a way to eat something that feels substantial, fills you up, and does not carry the caloric weight of the thing it is replacing. The 1960s did this with lime gelatin and shredded carrots. We do it with cauliflower rice and zucchini noodles. The vegetables have changed. The ambition is identical. Somewhere between the grapefruit in the morning and the cottage cheese at noon, the hard-boiled egg occupied a vital role in the daily architecture of the 1960s slim woman. They were made in batches on Sunday. They were stored in the refrigerator in a small bowl. They were carried to work wrapped in wax paper inside a handbag, alongside lipstick and a handkerchief, eaten at a desk or on a bench with total composure. The hard-boiled egg asked nothing of you. It required no refrigeration once wrapped, no utensils, no apology. The Sunday batch cooking of hard-boiled eggs was not called meal prep. It was not photographed or organized into a grid of matching glass containers. It was simply something a woman did on Sunday afternoon while the roast was in the oven and the children were somewhere else. A pot of eggs going into cold water, brought to a boil, and then left to sit for 12 minutes while she did 3 other things. The eggs were cooled, dried, and placed in a bowl in the refrigerator, with the unceremonious efficiency of someone who understood that preparation on Sunday made Tuesday considerably simpler. The hard-boiled egg diet, in various forms, had appeared in women's magazines since at least the 1930s, and by the 1960s had been absorbed into mainstream domestic eating in the way that genuinely useful ideas tend to be absorbed. It stopped being a diet and became a habit. Eggs were high in protein, cheap, available everywhere, and capable of lasting several days in the refrigerator without requiring any intervention on your part. They were filling in a way that outlasted the meal, keeping appetite quiet for hours in a way that a bowl of cereal or a slice of white toast simply could not. The wax paper wrapping was a small ceremony. You tore a square from the roll that lived in the kitchen drawer, placed the egg in the center, and folded the sides up with the practiced folds of someone who has wrapped things in paper many times before. The result was a small, neat package that fit at the bottom of a handbag without incident. When you unwrapped it at a desk or park bench or a lunch counter, the egg came out clean and cool, ready to be salted from the small paper twist of salt you had also wrapped and tucked alongside it, if you were the kind of person who thought ahead, which a surprising number of women in the 1960s quietly and consistently were. The hard-boiled egg eaten at a desk in a 1960s office was not a self-conscious act. Nobody was documenting their lunch. Nobody was explaining their dietary choices to an invisible audience. You unwrapped the egg, you salted it if you had salt, you ate it in 4 bites, and you went back to whatever you had been doing before hunger interrupted. There was a cleanness to this, not just in the eating, but in the relationship to the food. It was fuel. It was protein. It was what you had because it was sensible, and sensible was a quality the era genuinely admired. The egg has been through several decades of nutritional revision since then. It was celebrated, then vilified for the cholesterol in its yolk, then cautiously rehabilitated, then celebrated again with an enthusiasm that suggested everyone had forgotten the vilification. Through all of it, the hard-boiled egg has remained exactly what it was in 1963, a self-contained, efficient, portable protein that keeps you going without fanfare. Some things do not need revision. Some things are simply right the first time. It is dinner time in 1964, and the table is set with the good plates, the kind with a wide decorative border that takes up a meaningful amount of surface area. This was not an accident. A smaller plate in the 1960s was quietly revolutionary. But the more common trick, the one nobody talked about, was simply filling the decorative border with nothing and calling the empty ring good manners. The portion in the center was measured not by a food scale, but by a practiced eye that had been calibrated over years of feeding everyone else first. The dinner plates of the 1960s were often the wedding china or the Melmac sets that had replaced it in households that were not precious about breakage. They were large by the standards of what portion sizes actually required, and the decorative borders, floral, geometric, gold-rimmed O's, were genuinely wide. A modern nutritionist looking at a full plate of the era would recognize immediately that the architecture of the dish did part of the work. The visual frame of the border created a natural limit. Food placed within it looked complete. A plate filled to the rim looked excessive in a way that most women of the era would have found embarrassing. Portion awareness in the 1960s was not called portion control. It was called having sense. Women who grew up during the Depression and the wartime rationing years of the 1940s had internalized a relationship to food quantities that was not about restriction so much as proportion. You did not waste. You did not take more than you needed. You served yourself a portion that was correct, and correct was a judgment made by the eye and the stomach, and a general understanding of your own appetite that had been developed over decades of paying attention to it. The serving sizes themselves were smaller than what has become standard. Meat portions in 1960s cooking averaged around 3 to 4 ounces, roughly the size of a deck of cards, because that was how far the household budget stretched, and because that was what the recipes in Joy of Cooking and Betty Crocker assumed. The vegetables occupied a larger proportion of the plate than they do now. The starch was present, but not dominant. The meal was balanced in the way that things are balanced when cost and practicality are doing the balancing, rather than a wellness philosophy. Children were served from the same plates with portions adjusted down further, which meant the woman of the house was regularly making judgments about quantity and proportion for multiple people across a range of ages and appetites. This daily practice of calibrated serving, this constant assessment of how much is enough for this body right now, was over time an education in portion reality that no app has yet managed to replicate. You learned what a serving looked like because you made 100 servings in a row and watched what got eaten and what came back to the kitchen. The dinner plate trick, the one that nobody called a trick, was just this: knowing what the center of the plate should hold and letting the border do its quiet, decorative work around it. The meal looked complete. The body was appropriately fed, and nobody had to announce the discipline involved. Because in a household managed with this kind of quiet competence, the discipline was just the furniture. It was always there. You stopped noticing it. Let us step outside for a moment, because the 1960s Slim was not just about what went on the plate. It was about what went on the feet. Women walked. They walked to the corner store, to the bus stop, to the neighbor's house, to the library, to the dry cleaner. Not as exercise, not with a tracker on their wrist, not with a podcast in their ears. They walked because the car was with someone else, or because the errand was close enough, or because it was simply the way you moved through the day. And that movement, unremarkable and uncelebrated, added up. The geography of the American town in the 1960s still made walking practical in a way that the suburban expansion of the following decades would steadily erode. A corner store within 4 blocks, a bus line within walking distance of most residential streets, a school close enough that children walked to it unaccompanied, which meant their mothers had walked to drop them off and walked back. The dry cleaner, the library, the 5 and dime, these were destinations on foot, embedded into a daily circuit that covered a significant distance before noon without anyone having planned a workout. In cities, this was even more pronounced. Women who worked in offices or shops walked from subway stations or bus stops to their desks, back at lunch, back at the end of the day. The aggregate distance covered in a working week by a woman living in a walkable urban neighborhood in 1963 was considerable, and it was covered in heels, which is a detail worth noting. Not performance sneakers, not ergonomically designed walking shoes with moisture-wicking socks. Heels, on sidewalks, in all weather, because that was the shoe the era required and the era did not offer modifications. Suburban women walked differently, but they walked consistently. The neighborhood errand loop, across to one neighbor's house, down to another, back past the corner store, was the social and physical infrastructure of the suburb, and it happened on foot because the distances involved made driving feel unnecessarily formal. You did not get in the car to go 3 houses down. You put on your shoes and you went, carrying back whatever you needed in a bag held over your arm. And the return trip with the weight of the groceries added a small, incidental resistance workout that nobody would have thought to name. There is a line of research that has emerged in recent decades suggesting that low-level, consistent physical activity, the kind that is embedded in daily life rather than performed in a designated time slot, may be more metabolically beneficial than the concentrated exercise session that has become the modern substitute for it. The woman who walked to the store 3 times a week, climbed the stairs of her 2-story house a dozen times a day, hung laundry on a line, and pushed a manual mower across the lawn on Saturday was doing something that her granddaughter now pays a gym membership to approximate. None of this was called fitness. None of it was tracked. There were no step counts and no celebratory rings lighting up on a watch face when you hit the daily goal. There was just the morning, and the errands, and the distance between you and the things you needed, and the legs that took you there and back. It was not inspiring. It was not content. It was just Tuesday in 1963, and it was doing more work than anyone gave it credit for. It is the 3rd week of March, and the woman at the kitchen table is reading her copy of Ladies' Home Journal, with a cup of black coffee at her elbow and a pencil in her hand. She is circling something. It is a new diet. There was always a new diet. Grapefruit diets, hard-boiled egg diets, cabbage soup, the Hollywood 18-day diet. Each one arrived with the confidence of a cure and the shelf life of fresh produce. Women tried them with genuine curiosity, abandoned most of them by Thursday, and kept a quiet set of daily habits that did the actual work regardless of what the magazine said. The women's magazine in the 1960s was a specific kind of institution. It arrived monthly by mail or from the drugstore rack, and it contained, in every single issue without exception, at least one article about food, weight, and the management of the female body. Sometimes it was a recipe feature dressed in the language of health. Sometimes it was an interview with a doctor whose credentials were summarized in a single italicized line beneath his photograph. Sometimes it was a 2-page spread with a meal plan printed in a clean font that made it look more authoritative than it was. The reader circled things, tore out pages, tucked them into the kitchen drawer beside the church key opener and the rubber bands, and consulted them with varying degrees of commitment through the following weeks. The diets themselves were imaginative in a way that the present, with its macro-counted meal plans and nutrition apps, has largely abandoned. The Drinking Man's Diet of 1964 suggested that steak and cocktails were the path to thinness, which was a very specific kind of optimism. The Zen macrobiotic diet arrived from Japan with a philosophy attached. Stillman's water diet required 8 glasses of water alongside lean protein and absolutely nothing else, and it worked in the short term in the way that anything sufficiently severe tends to work in the short term. The magazines covered all of it with breathless enthusiasm and moved on to the next thing the following month. What is interesting, looking back, is not the diets themselves, but the relationship women had with them. The commitment was real, but it was also provisional. You tried the thing. You followed it for a week, perhaps 2. You lost a few pounds or you did not. And either way, the month eventually ended, and the new magazine arrived with a new article and a new approach, and the previous diet was filed away, without ceremony alongside all the others. This was not failure. This was a kind of practical empiricism, testing the claim against the body, noting the result, and remaining open to revision. Underneath all of it, the actual daily habits persisted undisturbed. The grapefruit in the morning, the light lunch, the soup, the walk. These were not the magazine diets. These were the things women did between magazine diets, and they were doing the real work. The magazine was the excitement. The habit was the substance. Most women in the 1960s understood the difference, even if they would not have articulated it that way. The pencil marks in the margins of those old magazines are still there, in the copies that survive in attic boxes and thrift store bins. Someone circled a meal plan in March of 1963 with a yellow pencil, pressed firmly enough to leave an indent in the page beneath it. She may have followed it for a week. She may have read it twice, and then made cottage cheese for lunch as usual. Either way, she kept the magazine. There was always the possibility that this one was the one that was going to make everything clear. The next issue was already on its way. It is noon, and on the stove there is a small saucepan with a can of soup being heated. Campbell's, most likely. Tomato or chicken noodle, or the cream of mushroom that could be poured over almost anything and turn it into a casserole, a sauce, or a sense of purpose. Soup was lunch in the way that the lunch counter had been lunch for the previous generation. A reliable, unassuming meal that did not ask too much of you, but gave you enough to keep going until dinner. Low in calories before anyone was counting them. The Campbell Soup Company had been a fixture of the American pantry since the early 20th century, and by the 1960s its red and white cans were as familiar as the shapes of the rooms they lived in. The condensed soups were sold at a price that made them accessible to nearly every household budget, and the preparation required almost no thought. Add 1 can of water or milk, heat, stir, serve. The instruction was printed right on the label in clear type, which was either helpful or slightly insulting depending on your relationship with cooking. And most women had made enough cans of Campbell's to have stopped consulting the label years ago. Tomato soup at noon was a particular kind of lunch. The color in the bowl was warm and slightly orange, and the smell of it heating in the saucepan was one of the most recognizable domestic smells of the era, sweet and tomatoey and faintly salty, with the particular quality of something simplified and concentrated until it is more essentially itself than the thing it began as. You ate it with crackers, usually saltines, broken into pieces that softened in the broth. And the combination of warm liquid and dissolved cracker produced a satisfaction that had nothing to do with calorie content and everything to do with comfort and temperature, and the small pleasure of a meal that required no negotiation. The chicken noodle was lighter and more austere. The noodles were thin and soft in the way of canned noodles, yielding and entirely without pretension. The broth was pale gold and salty, and it steamed in the bowl with the urgency of something that had been waiting on the stove for exactly this moment. Women who were watching themselves closely chose this one at noon, knowing it was filling in a liquid way that would not sit heavily through the afternoon. It was, in the nutritional vocabulary that has since developed, exactly what it appears to be: low in calories, moderate in sodium, light enough to eat on a Tuesday when there was still a full afternoon ahead of you. The act of tasting the soup directly from the ladle, before it was fully transferred to a bowl, happened more often than anyone documented. Not from deprivation, not from rush, from the particular pleasure of something warm and immediate, a taste taken before the official meal began, private and without ceremony, the cook's quiet prerogative in a kitchen that was otherwise managed entirely for other people. Soup as a daily lunch practice has the virtue of being almost automatically self-limiting. The bowl is the bowl. The can makes approximately 2 servings, and a woman eating alone took one. There was no second portion waiting on the counter, no bread basket, no refill. The meal was bounded by its container, which gave it a natural limit that required no willpower to enforce. The 1960s did not call this a strategy. It was just how you heated soup, and it was, without anyone announcing it, one of the quietest and most effective things the era did. It is Saturday evening, and the table is set, and the guests are arriving, and the woman who has spent the better part of Saturday in the kitchen has arranged everything beautifully and is now standing at the stove, putting the last touches on a pot roast she will serve in 12 minutes. She will not eat much of it. This is not virtue. This is not a diet. It is simply the physics of being the person who managed the meal. By the time the food has been served, the guests have been attended to. The children have been fed and sent somewhere else. The act of eating has become a smaller, quieter thing than it was for anyone else at that table. The Saturday dinner party was a social institution of the 1960s suburb that required extensive, invisible labor. The menu was planned earlier in the week. The grocery shopping was done by Thursday. Friday was for preparation, the rolling of the pastry, the soaking of the beans, the making of the gelatin mold that would serve as the first course, and spend Friday night in the refrigerator, setting in its ring pan with the quiet patience of something that knows exactly what it is going to do tomorrow. Saturday was for the final assembly, the timing, the management of multiple things happening simultaneously at different temperatures and different requirements. By the time the guests sat down and the first plates were served, the hostess had been on her feet for the better part of 8 hours. Her appetite had moved through its natural cycle, peaked around noon, subsided through the afternoon when the kitchen was too warm and the work too constant to eat comfortably, and arrived at dinner time in a state that was more mechanical than hungry. She ate because eating with guests was what you did. She ate less than everyone else because her relationship with the food was different from theirs. She had made it. She had smelled it all day. She had tasted it from the ladle half a dozen times. By the time it arrived on her own plate, it was a familiar thing rather than a desirable one. This is a phenomenon that professional cooks have documented for decades. The chef who cannot eat the dish they have spent 8 hours preparing, not from lack of appreciation, but from the particular satiation that comes from proximity and repetition. The smell of something cooking for a long time in a closed kitchen does something to appetite that sitting down to a fresh plate does not. The women of the 1960s were not professional chefs, but they were managing professional-scale domestic production in home kitchens, and the effect on appetite was the same. There is also something in the social architecture of the dinner party that kept the hostess's plate modest. She was up and back between the kitchen and the table. She was watching for empty glasses. She was the one who noticed when the butter dish needed refilling, or when a guest's expression suggested the gravy was not quite what it should have been. Eating in that state of distributed attention produced a slower, more interrupted meal than anyone else at the table was having, and slower eating tends, as any researcher who has studied it will tell you, to produce a natural reduction in the quantity consumed. None of this was strategic. The hostess was not executing a caloric plan on a Saturday night. She was simply doing the thing she had agreed to do, for people she cared about in the role she had accepted as hers. The effect on her eating was incidental. It happened to be useful. The body kept the tally regardless, as it always does, whether or not anyone at the table was paying the slightest attention. You are standing at a salad bowl and you are reaching for the oil and vinegar, not the creamy dressing, not the thick, pale, ranch-style affair that has not yet been invented in any dominant way. In 1962, the dressing of choice was sharp and thin and tart. Oil and red wine vinegar, maybe a little mustard, a pinch of something dried from a small glass jar at the back of the spice cabinet. The salad beneath it was iceberg lettuce, probably, with a tomato and a scallion, and it tasted clean in the way that only simple things can. The oil and vinegar dressing had the particular virtue of being self-limiting in a way that creamy dressings are not. You poured a small amount of each directly onto the salad and tossed it, and the result was a coating rather than a pooling. The leaves glossed lightly rather than submerged. A tablespoon of oil, a teaspoon of vinegar, a pinch of dried oregano, or a half teaspoon of mustard to hold the emulsion for the 20 seconds before it broke again. The entire operation cost perhaps 60 calories. This was not calculated. It was just what dressing was, and what dressing was happened to be light. The bottled French dressing that appeared on grocery store shelves was a different thing, sweeter, slightly orange from the paprika and sugar, and marketed with the cheerful confidence of a product that knows it is going to be on the table every night for the next 40 years. Women used it on iceberg wedges and on the simple green salads that accompanied dinner, and it was neither as heavy as ranch nor as austere as straight vinegar, occupying a middle ground mild enough not to offend anyone at the table. It was the dressing of compromise, which made it the dressing of many households, sitting comfortably in the refrigerator door beside the mustard and the sweet pickles. Italian dressing made from a good season's packet was a more ambitious project. The cruet had lines marked on it for each ingredient, so that the correct ratio of vinegar to oil to water to powder was achieved without measuring, and the result was a dressing with actual herb flavor. Oregano, basil, garlic, a flicker of something sharp and green. The Good Seasons packet was a 1960s pantry staple with the same unremarkable dependability as the Campbell's soup, and it produced a dressing that was lower in calories than any creamy alternative and considerably more interesting than plain oil and vinegar. Women who used it felt, not unreasonably, that they had done something slightly sophisticated with the salad course. Ranch dressing was invented in the early 1950s at a ranch in California and sold as a dry seasoning packet from the late 50s onward, but it did not achieve its current cultural dominance until the 1980s and beyond. In the 1960s kitchen, it was present but peripheral, a curiosity rather than a default. The default was the thin, acid-forward dressing that let the vegetables beneath it remain recognizably themselves. This was, nutritionally, the correct default, although it was chosen for reasons of taste and convention, rather than any conscious awareness of what the creamy alternative was going to do to the American waistline once it arrived in full force. The salad itself was not complicated. Iceberg lettuce, which has since been dismissed as nutritionally inferior to its darker cousins, has the considerable virtue of being crisp, mild, and filling in the way of things with high water content. A wedge of it, dressed with oil and vinegar and a pinch of salt, sat in the stomach as a cool, substantial thing before the main course arrived, which meant the main course was met with less urgency. The 1960s did not call this a satiety strategy. They called it starting with your salad. Same thing, different century. There is a scale in the bathroom. It is the old mechanical kind, with a needle that swings and lands with a soft click on a number you either accept quietly or carry with you to the kitchen where you reconsider the cream in your coffee. In the 1960s, the bathroom scale was a fixture in the American home the way the television was. Present, consulted regularly, capable of determining the mood of the morning. Women weighed themselves not as part of a fitness program, but as a kind of private audit, a daily accounting between themselves and the mirror. The mechanical bathroom scale of the era had a personality. It required you to stand on it with a particular stillness and read the needle from a specific angle, because parallax was real, and the number from the left was different from the number from the right by a margin of a pound or so, which meant women developed a consistent reading technique over time. Same position, same angle, same time of morning, before coffee, after the bathroom, in the particular light that came through the frosted window. The ritual had a precision to it that the casual observer would not have predicted from the instrument itself, which looked simple and was not. The cultural expectation that produced this ritual was not subtle. The 1960s were a decade in which the female body was measured against a specific and narrow ideal, communicated through fashion, through film, through the measurements printed in women's magazines, alongside photographs of models who looked the way the decade had decided women should look. Twiggy arrived in 1966 and made that ideal sharper and more angular than it had been before, and the bathroom scales across America registered the increased pressure right alongside the weight. This is not comfortable to romanticize, and it would be dishonest to try. The cultural expectations placed on women's bodies in the 1960s caused real harm, in the anxiety they produced, in the diets they motivated, in the particular strain of self-surveillance that became the background noise of daily life for a great many women. The bathroom scale was an instrument of that surveillance as much as it was a practical tool, and the morning weigh-in was never entirely free of the cultural weight it carried alongside the number. And yet, there is something else worth acknowledging. The daily weigh-in, practiced consistently and without drama, functions as an information system. Women who stepped on the scale every morning developed an accurate, ongoing understanding of how their bodies responded to what they ate and how they moved. A pound up after a weekend was information. A pound down after a week of soups and walks was information. The trend over time was information. This was not sophisticated biometrics. It was a needle on a dial and a woman paying attention. And paying attention was, in its practical effects, genuinely useful. The bathroom scale has been through its own cultural revision since the 1960s, condemned, defended, replaced by smart scales that send data to phones, abandoned in some homes entirely. The argument about whether to own one continues with an energy that suggests it has never been just about the number. It has always been about the relationship between the number and the person reading it, and that relationship is as complicated now as it was when the needle swung and settled on a Tuesday morning in 1964, and a woman in a housecoat stood very still and looked down and decided what the day was going to be. Dinner is finished and the dishes have been cleared, and from the refrigerator comes a bowl of something cool and sweet. Not cake, not cookies, not every night. A bowl of canned peaches, a sliced banana with a drizzle of something, a halved cantaloupe with a small scoop of vanilla ice cream nestled in the hollow, which somehow felt like a full dessert because of the way it was presented, with a long spoon and a little ceremony. Fruit as dessert was not deprivation in the 1960s, it was just Tuesday. The dessert expectation in a 1960s household was real. Dinner without something sweet afterward felt unfinished in the same way that a sentence without a period feels unfinished, structurally incomplete, slightly unsatisfying to the part of the brain that has been trained to expect resolution. Women understood this expectation and managed it with a practicality that was neither strict nor indulgent, but somewhere in between, calibrated by the day of the week, the contents of the refrigerator, and the general emotional weather of the household that particular evening. Weekends were for the baked thing, the bundt cake, the apple pie with the crimped crust, the sheet cake with frosting spread imperfectly with a butter knife. These were real desserts made with butter and sugar and eggs, and the kind of applied effort that turned the Sunday kitchen into a place with its own warmth and smell. Nobody pretended these were diet food. They were Sunday. The rules of Sunday were different from the rules of Tuesday, and the distinction was understood by everyone at the table without it ever needing to be announced. Tuesday was fruit. Canned peaches from the pantry, transferred to a bowl and chilled, with perhaps a little of the syrup poured over the top. The Del Monte label and the particular amber sweetness of peach and syrup, cold from the refrigerator, eaten with a small fork and no apology. Or a banana sliced into a bowl and served with a tablespoon of sour cream and a dusting of brown sugar. A combination that sounds faintly improvised but tasted, in the specific context of a Tuesday night kitchen in 1963, completely intentional. Or a simple bowl of strawberries in June, hulled and sliced and left to macerate in their own juice for 20 minutes until a natural syrup formed at the bottom of the bowl that you drank when the berries were gone. The cantaloupe with ice cream was a weeknight act of slight ceremony. The melon halved, the seeds scooped cleanly out, a small oval of vanilla placed in the hollow. 2 ingredients and a clean spoon. But the presentation, the orange of the melon, the white of the ice cream, the long-handled dessert spoon, produced something that looked considered and tasted like more than its components individually. The ice cream softened against the cold melon and took on its sweetness, and the melon absorbed a little of the dairy richness, and the result was something specific and pleasant that neither ingredient could produce alone. The quiet genius of fruit as regular dessert is that it satisfies the dessert expectation. Sweet, cold, slightly special, signaling the end of the meal, at a fraction of the caloric cost of the baked alternative. The body receives the signal it was waiting for. The meal concludes. The kitchen closes for the evening, and nobody had to call it a strategy or perform any visible act of restraint, because restraint was not the point and never had been. Tuesday was the point. The peaches in the refrigerator were Tuesday, and on Tuesday they were perfectly adequate, which in the 1960s was exactly the same thing as being perfectly enough. Let us talk about a principle that no one in 1962 called a principle. Women in that era had an almost instinctive understanding that the midday meal should be small, not skipped. Skipping was not the culture, at least not until later in the decade, when fasting became fashionable in certain women's magazines, but modest. A plate that suggested a pause rather than an indulgence. A meal that kept you going without weighing you down for the afternoon. Cottage cheese, half a sandwich on a single slice, soup and 4 crackers. Lunch was a transaction, not an event. The logic of the small lunch was embedded in the daily structure of the era in a way that made it feel less like a choice and more like the natural shape of the day. Breakfast was modest. The grapefruit, the black coffee, perhaps a piece of toast. Dinner was the main meal, prepared with effort and eaten with the household assembled, with a protein and a vegetable and a starch and the social gravity that came from sitting down together. Lunch was the thing in between. It filled the gap. It was not meant to be the center of anything, and a meal that does not try to be the center of anything is, almost by definition, a smaller meal than one that does. The women who stayed home managed lunch for themselves with a different calculus than the women who worked outside the house. For the woman at home, lunch was often what she ate alone, standing at the counter or sitting briefly at the kitchen table before the afternoon reassembled itself around her. It was the meal with the most freedom and the least ceremony, which meant it was the meal most subject to personal discipline or the quiet absence of it. A woman eating lunch alone made her own decisions about what went on the plate, and the decision, made consistently across years, accumulated into something that no diet plan could replicate, because no diet plan had its patience. For women who worked, in the 1960s saw growing numbers of women in offices, shops, and schools. Lunch was the meal eaten quickly during a break that was never quite long enough. A sandwich from home in wax paper. A bowl of soup at the nearby lunch counter if the budget allowed. A hard-boiled egg and a piece of fruit eaten at a desk while the typewriter sat idle for 20 minutes. These lunches were small, not as a matter of philosophy, but as a matter of time and circumstance, and the smallness was incidentally useful in ways nobody was calculating, but everyone was benefiting from. There is a body of research developed decades after the 1960s suggesting that the body processes midday calories more efficiently than evening ones, and that a larger lunch with a smaller dinner might be a more sensible nutritional architecture. The 1960s did it the other way around, with a small lunch and a larger dinner, and women managed their weight effectively on that schedule regardless, which is either a critique of the later research or a testament to the power of consistency over optimization. Perhaps both. What the small lunch created, practically speaking, was an afternoon that moved. There is a particular quality to the post-large lunch afternoon that anyone who has eaten past their capacity at noon will recognize. The slight heaviness, the difficulty concentrating, the desire to be horizontal that has to be actively resisted. The woman who had eaten a scoop of cottage cheese and 4 crackers at noon did not have this problem. She was not a monk. She was just not full. And it turned out, across the whole of the 1960s, that not being full in the afternoon was a quietly useful way to live. There is something in the pantry that deserves a full accounting, and that something is a can of fruit cocktail with the Del Monte label and a syrup inside it that was, in moderate amounts, considered an entirely respectable component of the 1960s diet. Chilled, drained, spooned into a small glass dessert bowl, it was elegant in the way that only the 1960s could make a canned thing feel elegant. There were maraschino cherries in it, which felt festive. There were the little cubes of pear and peach, which felt balanced. Del Monte introduced canned fruit cocktail to the American market in the 1930s, and by the 1960s it was a pantry staple with the same comfortable familiarity as the Campbell's soup and the Jell-O powder. You bought it by the case when it was on sale. You kept 4 or 5 cans on the shelf and rotated them with a domestic conscientiousness that was not called inventory management, but was functionally identical to it. The cans had a satisfying weight. The label was cheerful and dependable. The contents, once opened and transferred to a bowl and placed in the refrigerator, were ready within an hour and lasted the better part of a week if they were not eaten before then. The fruit cocktail served multiple functions in the 1960s kitchen. It was a weeknight dessert, spooned into the small glass bowls with scalloped edges that most households owned as part of a set. It was a side dish alongside cottage cheese at lunch, where its sweetness complemented the mild dairy in a way that felt deliberate and slightly civilized. It appeared on the gelatin mold, arranged decoratively before the gelatin set, so that when the mold was unmolded onto its bed of lettuce, the fruit was visible in a cheerful pattern through the translucent walls. It was given to children as an afternoon treat in a small bowl with a small spoon, and it was received with an enthusiasm that suggested children of the era had not yet encountered the range of sweet alternatives that was coming for them. The syrup was a point of personal policy in every household that kept the cans. Some women drained it completely, patiently holding the lid against the fruit and tilting the can until the syrup ran clear into the sink, treating it as an excess to be discarded, a sweetness tax that came with the contents and was not required. Others drained loosely, allowing enough syrup to coat the fruit in the bowl and make the dessert glossier and slightly more festive. A small number did not drain at all, accepting the full can as the portion and the portion as acceptable, which was a position that required a certain confidence to maintain in a decade that had opinions about these things. The 1970s brought changes to the canned fruit landscape. Lighter syrup options, fruit packed in juice, a general movement toward what the packaging began calling natural, that the 1960s had not yet felt the need to market. The fruit cocktail of the 1960s made no claims to naturalness. It was cooked and preserved and sweet in the unambiguous way of things that do not pretend to be something other than what they are. And this honesty was part of its charm. It was exactly what the label said. It was in the pantry. It went into a bowl and came out of the refrigerator cold and tasted like a small, adequate pleasure that asked nothing of you except a can opener and approximately 45 minutes of patience. There are worse things to keep in the pantry. The 1960s kept this one, and the era was not worse for it. It is 3 in the afternoon, and you are not eating anything. Not because you are disciplined, not because you are following a program, but because it is 3 in the afternoon, and the kitchen is not open at 3 in the afternoon. The concept of the snack, the individually portioned, commercially produced, always available thing you eat between meals, because a food company has decided the gap between lunch and dinner is a business opportunity, has not yet colonized the culture in the way it is about to. In 1962, you ate at meals. Between meals, you waited. The three-meal structure of the 1960s household was not a diet philosophy. It was the architecture of the day. Breakfast happened in the morning before the house dispersed to its various destinations. Lunch happened at noon, wherever noon found you, at home, at a counter, at a desk. Dinner happened in the evening when the household reassembled. These three events were the structure. Between them was not eating time. Between them was everything else. The work, the errands, the conversations, the children, the housework, the thousand small negotiations that made up a day. Food was not available between these points, not because anyone was restricting it, but because the culture had not yet built the infrastructure for continuous eating. The snack food industry as it exists now was in its infancy in the early 1960s and would grow explosively through the late 60s and into the 70s as television advertising aimed at children created new demand, and supermarket shelf space expanded to accommodate new products. Potato chips existed. Cheese crackers existed. Oreos had been around since 1912. But these were not yet the omnipresent, always open category of consumption they would become. They were treats associated with specific occasions: a bag of chips at a picnic, cookies on a Friday afternoon, something special at the movie theater. They were not a daily background habit because the culture had not yet organized itself around the premise that the hours between meals were a problem requiring a solution. The absence of snacking was partly economic. Buying things specifically to eat between meals was an expense that many households did not incur as a matter of course. Food budgets were managed carefully, and $1 spent on snack food was $1 not spent on the ingredients of dinner. Children came home from school and had an apple or a glass of milk and waited for dinner, not because they were denied anything, but because the apple and the milk were what was available, and dinner was coming at 6, and the gap was perfectly survivable. The waiting itself was unremarkable. Hunger between meals was not a crisis requiring immediate resolution. It was simply the feeling that dinner was getting closer. The metabolic implications of the three-meal structure are significant and have been confirmed by research conducted long after the era that practiced it without thinking to name it. Extended periods between meals allow insulin levels to fall, creating conditions more favorable to fat metabolism than the continuous eating pattern that became standard in the decades that followed. The modern habit of consuming something every 2 to 3 hours across a 16-hour waking day keeps insulin elevated in a way that the 1960s pattern simply did not. Women in 1962 were practicing something that has since been given the clinical name of time-restricted eating. They were not practicing it intentionally. They were living the day the way the day was shaped. 3 in the afternoon, nothing in the hand, dinner at 6. The distance between the 2 points was not a hardship. It was just Tuesday, and Tuesday had always been this way, and nobody was keeping a journal about it or building a following around it. It was simply the shape of the day, and the shape of the day was, as it turned out, quietly doing its job. There is a drawer in the kitchen, or perhaps a shelf in the pantry, or possibly a small ceramic dish near the percolator, and in it lives something chocolatey that is being rationed with extraordinary self-control. One piece, perhaps after dinner, perhaps only on weekdays when nothing else is asking to be celebrated. A thin mint, a single square broken from a larger bar. A chocolate that was enjoyed not because the whole bar was absent, but because one square was, in some way, that defies the logic of modern consumption, genuinely enough. The relationship between women in the 1960s and chocolate was neither a tormented love affair nor a clinical program of avoidance. It was something quieter and more practical than either a managed pleasure, enjoyed in specific amounts at specific times, with neither the guilt of excess nor the performance of restraint. The chocolate was in the house. The chocolate was known to be in the house. And the amount consumed on any given evening was determined not by the number of squares remaining in the bar, but by the amount that satisfied the particular quality of desire that had arrived after dinner. That amount, for a great many women in that era, was 1. The Thin Mint was architecturally designed for this kind of measured pleasure. It was small. It was individually discrete in a way that a bar requiring breaking was not. You took one from the sleeve, replaced the sleeve in the drawer, and ate it with the quiet attention of someone who has decided that this is the amount and has arranged the conditions so that the decision does not need to be revisited later in the evening. The mint flavor produced a clean finish that effectively closed the dessert chapter of the night. Because nothing tastes quite right after mint, and most people know this instinctively. This was, whether it was intended to be or not, an appetite management technique of elegant simplicity, requiring no willpower at the moment of operation, because the willpower had been deployed earlier at the level of the drawer. The larger chocolate bar broken into squares invited a different kind of engagement. A Hershey bar, scored into its 12 sections, required an active decision to break off the piece and a subsequent decision not to break off another. Women who were practiced at this, and many were, through years of consistent small choices, rather than heroic acts of self-denial, had developed the habit in the same way any habit develops, through repetition until the behavior becomes the path of least resistance. They liked 1 square. They had always had 1 square. The expectation of 1 square was so established that 2 felt like excess in a way that was not about morality, but about preference. The way a person who has always taken their coffee black finds cream faintly too much, even when it is offered kindly. The science of chocolate consumption has since established what the women of 1962 knew without scientific confirmation, that a small amount enjoyed intentionally and without distraction produces a satisfaction disproportionate to its quantity. The reward response peaks quickly and does not proportionally increase with additional pieces. 1 square is, neurologically speaking, most of what 2 squares would give you. The women who stopped at 1 were not missing out on the second. They were simply stopping at the point of maximum return, which is, when you think about it, the best possible place to stop. The ceramic dish near the percolator held perhaps 6 thin mints, or a few wrapped chocolates from a Christmas box, or the remaining end of a bar broken into squares across the better part of a week. It was not hidden away. It was not locked in a cabinet as a test of character. It was simply there, at a specific quantity, understood to last a specific number of evenings. The portion was not what the package said. The portion was what had been quietly decided, long before any given evening arrived. That decision, made once and then simply lived, was doing more work than any program that required daily recommitment, and it was doing it in a ceramic dish by the coffee maker, without making any kind of fuss about itself at all. Pour yourself something cold and slightly strange. In the 1960s, buttermilk was drunk regularly by women who had grown up in households where nothing that could nourish you was allowed to go to waste. It was tart and thick, and it sat in the glass, with the confidence of something that knew it was good for you even before anyone had invented the word probiotic. Buttermilk was not fashionable. It was not on the magazine covers. But it was in the refrigerator in a great many homes, and it was consumed with a quiet loyalty that people in that era reserved for things that worked. The buttermilk of the 1960s was not the thin, watery approximation that sometimes passes for it now. It was the genuine article, the liquid left behind after cream had been churned into butter, tangy and slightly viscous, with a smell that was sharply dairy and a taste that took a moment to accommodate, but then became, for those who drank it regularly, one of the more satisfying cold drinks available from the refrigerator door. It was sold in quart cartons at the grocery store alongside the regular milk, priced modestly, and purchased by women who had learned to drink it from their own mothers, who had learned from theirs, in an unbroken chain of practical nutrition that stretched back to farm kitchens generations removed. The protein content was substantial for a drink. A glass of buttermilk carried roughly 8 grams of protein, comparable to regular milk, with a fat content that varied by brand, but was generally lower than whole milk and carrying a caloric count that made it a reasonable choice for a woman paying attention to herself. The tartness produced a satiety signal that plain water did not. Something about the acidity and the dairy fat and the protein together told the body that it had received something real, and the body responded accordingly by quieting down for the next several hours. Women drank it at lunch, sometimes in place of the soup, sometimes alongside a cracker and piece of cheese. They drank it in the late afternoon when the kitchen was quiet and dinner was still an hour away, and the gap needed filling with something that would not undo the restraint of the day. They used it in cooking, in pancakes, in biscuits, in the occasional salad dressing where its acidity stood in for vinegar, with a richer, more complex result. The carton in the refrigerator was never decorative. It was working. The probiotic benefits of fermented dairy were not understood in the 1960s in the clinical terms that have since been developed. The research connecting gut bacteria to weight management, to immune function, to metabolic health was decades away from being conducted. But the women who drank buttermilk did not need the research to tell them what they had already observed, that it settled the stomach, that it kept you regular in the way that the era discussed only in the most oblique terms, and that it made the afternoon easier in a way that was difficult to attribute to any other single thing. They drank it because it worked. The science caught up later. It usually does. There is something quietly admirable about a food that does its job without requiring anyone to know its mechanisms. Buttermilk did not need a marketing campaign or a clinical study or a wellness influencer to give it credibility. It needed a cold glass and someone willing to acquire the taste. And the women who had acquired it were among the most quietly, consistently healthy people in the room. The carton is still in the dairy aisle, in the same place it has always been. Most people walk past it. Some people still stop. There is something that does not appear in any diet book from the 1960s, because it was not considered a diet. It was just cooking. The woman at the stove made a chicken for 4 people. She served the 4 people. She ate what remained, which was, by the logic of the serving, slightly less than everyone else. Not because she was told to, not because it was written down anywhere, but because feeding a household is a practice that tends to leave the cook in a particular relationship with the food, present for all of it, hungry for some of it, and quietly satisfied by the whole operation in a way that does not require the plate to be full. The mechanics of cooking for a family in the 1960s involved a kind of constant proximity to food that produced over time a specific and practical relationship with appetite. You handled the chicken raw and then cooked. You tasted the soup from the ladle at intervals through the afternoon. You tested the mashed potatoes for seasoning twice. You cut a corner of the roast to check the interior before you brought it to the table. By the time the meal was plated and carried to the dining room, you had been in close sensory contact with the food for the better part of an hour, and the hunger that sits at the front of appetite, the sharp, urgent kind, had been softened by proximity into something more moderate and more manageable. This is not a strategy that can be packaged and sold. It is not a program. It is simply what happens to appetite when you are the person who made the thing rather than the person who received it. Chefs have described this for decades. The line cook who cannot eat after service, the baker who has no appetite for bread because they have been breathing flour and yeast since 4 a.m. The women of the 1960s were experiencing the domestic version of this phenomenon every evening in their own kitchens, quietly and without documentation. There was also the matter of serving order. The family was served first. Plates were made up for the children, then for the husband, then for any guests, and then, with whatever remained in the serving dishes, for the woman who had made all of it. This was not deprivation in the way that would make a modern observer uncomfortable. It was the ordinary social physics of a household in which the cook was also the manager of the meal, and the manager's portion was what was left after everyone else's portion had been determined. The left portion was smaller. This was just arithmetic. The nutritional consequence of this arrangement played out across thousands of dinners across thousands of households in the 1960s was a consistent, unremarkable, never-named caloric moderation at the evening meal that accumulated into something significant over years. It was not chosen for reasons of weight management. It was the byproduct of a social arrangement that placed the woman of the house last at the table by custom and convenience. That it happened to be useful to her body was incidental. The body, as always, kept the tally without being asked. The arrangement has changed, and the change is in most respects correct and overdue. But the metabolic accident embedded within the old arrangement is worth noting plainly, because it was doing real work that is harder to replicate now that the cook and the served are more often the same person eating the same portion at the same time. What was lost when the arrangement changed was not just inequity. Something else left with it, quietly, and without anyone noticing until much later. It is 10 in the morning, and the floors have been swept. The beds have been made. The laundry is in the machine, and the woman of the house is now going up the stairs, for the 4th time before noon, because she forgot something and then remembered something else. None of this has been logged. None of it has a name. There is no step counter on her wrist, no app receiving the data. And yet the physical labor of running a household in the 1960s, before the widespread arrival of dishwashers and dryers, and every labor-saving device that was coming, was considerable. Women moved, constantly, without being told to. The household technology available to the average American home in the early 1960s was substantially less automated than what followed. The washing machine existed, but for many households it was a wringer type that required physical management of the clothes through the rollers, followed by carrying the wet laundry outside to the line and hanging each piece with wooden pins and later retrieving it and carrying it inside and folding it. The automatic dryer was becoming more common through the decade, but the clothesline remained standard in many neighborhoods through the 1960s and into the 70s, and the physical circuit of the laundry and washer to basket, to line to basket to folding table, to linen closet, covered real distance and required real effort that a modern washer-dryer combination simply does not. The floor cleaning was similarly physical. A vacuum cleaner that needed to be pushed with meaningful effort across carpets and rugs that were heavier and thicker than today's synthetic equivalents. Hard floors swept with a broom and then mopped with a mop wrung by hand over a bucket. The kitchen floor scrubbed on hands and knees with a brush, which was considered correct and thorough in a way that the standing mop was not. The windows washed by hand with a cloth and a bucket of vinegar water, inside and out, on a ladder if the house had 2 stories. These were not casual tasks. They were physical labor performed weekly in a body that was also managing 3 meals, several children, and whatever else the day required. The stair climbing alone, in a 2-story house, amounted to something significant by the end of the day. Researchers studying what has come to be called non-exercise activity thermogenesis, the calories burned through all physical activity that is not formal exercise, have found that it can account for a difference of several hundred calories per day between individuals, a difference that accumulates to pounds across months without a single gym visit or planned workout. The woman climbing the stairs of her 2-story house in 1963 was generating this thermogenesis with every trip, and she was making many trips every day. because the house was large and the tasks were distributed across its floors, and nobody had yet invented a reason to consolidate them. What this amounts to is a body that was in motion throughout the day in a low-level, constant way that is genuinely difficult to replicate, in a life organized around sitting, at a desk, in a car, on a couch, with a designated exercise period inserted as compensation. The exercise period compensates for some of it. It does not compensate for all of it. The women of the 1960s were not fit because they were disciplined athletes. They were fit because the day had not yet been engineered into stillness, and their bodies moved through it accordingly, up the stairs and back down, out to the line and back in, across the kitchen floor and around to the other side, all day without anyone counting a single step. Dinner is finished, the dishes are done, the light outside has gone the particular amber color it goes in late summer evenings in the suburbs, low and warm, and landing on the front lawns in a way that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is. And the woman of the house is pulling on a cardigan and stepping out the front door for a walk around the block. Maybe 2 blocks. Maybe down to the corner and back. Not a workout. Not training for anything. Just a walk, the kind that happens after dinner the way coffee happens after breakfast. As a natural continuation, a small motion that settles the evening and closes the meal with a quiet sense of completion. The after-dinner walk was a cultural habit in the 1960s that operated without the vocabulary of wellness and entirely without performance. Nobody was tracking it. Nobody was posting about it. It was simply something people did in the evenings in neighborhoods where the sidewalks connected to other sidewalks and the streets were quiet enough to walk on without anxiety. Couples walked together and talked or did not talk. Women walked alone, or with a neighbor who had come out at the same moment for the same reason, and they walked side by side and spoke about whatever the evening had left unfinished, or they said very little and let the movement do its work. The metabolic case for the after-dinner walk has since been made with considerable rigor by researchers studying postprandial glucose response, the rise in blood sugar that follows a meal, which is influenced by physical activity in the minutes and hours after eating. Even a 10-minute walk taken within 30 minutes of finishing dinner measurably reduces the glucose spike that the meal produces, which has implications for insulin sensitivity, for weight management, and for long-term metabolic health that the women of the 1960s were experiencing without any access to the mechanism. They walked because the evening was pleasant, and the neighborhood was there, and the body wanted movement after sitting. The blood sugar response was happening regardless of whether anyone knew to look for it. The neighborhood itself made the walk possible and appealing in a way that the design of many later suburban developments did not. The streets of the 1960s suburb were generally organized around the assumption of pedestrian movement, sidewalks on both sides, houses close enough to the street to give the walker something to look at, a corner store or a neighbor's lit porch to serve as a destination or a waypoint. The walk had a route, and the route had familiar landmarks, and the landmarks changed slowly enough across seasons to provide a kind of gentle, ongoing chronicle of the neighborhood that you only received if you were out in it on foot at the same time each evening. There is a kind of thinking that happens on an evening walk that does not happen anywhere else. Not the effortful thinking of a problem being worked on, but the associative, wandering kind that arrives when the body is moving at a comfortable pace and the mind is not required to produce anything in particular. Women in the 1960s walked and thought in this way every evening, and the thinking was its own form of settling, a decompression of the day that the body and the mind both participated in, arriving at the front door again 20 minutes later in a state that was perceptibly calmer than the state that had left. The evening has gotten busier since then, or it has at least been filled with other things, screens, obligations, the particular exhaustion that comes from a day spent mostly sitting and somehow still completely spent. The cardigan is still in the closet. The sidewalk is still there. The amber light still happens in summer at the same hour it always did, landing on the front lawns in the same way. Some evenings, it is still enough. Let us come back to the kitchen table one last time, because this is where it all lives, not in a single food or a single habit, but in the accumulation of small daily choices that nobody tracked, nobody published, and nobody particularly celebrated. The grapefruit in the morning, the light lunch, the soup, the walk, the one square of chocolate, the dinner plate with the decorative border, the hard-boiled egg in the handbag. None of it was called a diet. None of it was given a name or a hashtag or a before and after photograph. It was simply the way a woman moved through a day, in a body she lived in a time that expected a certain kind of quiet competence from her in all things, including this. The cumulative effect of these habits, practiced daily, consistently, without drama, is what current behavioral science calls a system rather than a strategy. A strategy requires effort at every deployment. A system, once established, runs on its own. The grapefruit was not a decision you made every morning. It was just what the morning looked like. The soup was not a choice you weighed against alternatives at noon. It was what was in the saucepan and what went in the bowl, and what you ate at the kitchen table before the afternoon began. The walk was not a scheduled commitment you could skip. It was simply the thing that happened after the dishes. The system was the sum of all of it, and the sum required almost no active maintenance once it was in place, because it was not a program. It was just the shape of a life. What made it work was not the individual pieces. Grapefruit alone does not keep anyone slim. A single evening walk does not offset a month of careless eating. The hard-boiled egg in the handbag is just a hard-boiled egg. What made it work was the architecture, the way the pieces fitted together across the hours of the day, so that each one supported the next. The grapefruit and black coffee in the morning kept appetite quiet through the late morning. The light lunch kept the afternoon moving. The no snacking between meals kept insulin doing what it was meant to do. The soup, the decorated plate, the fruit dessert, the single chocolate boy, each one a small bounded pleasure that satisfied without exceeding. The walk at the end, to close the account. It was not magic, it was carpentry. It was the daily construction of a day that did not leave too much room for the things that would have undone it. It is also worth saying plainly what this was not. It was not joyless. The women who lived this way were not suffering through their days in a state of managed deprivation, counting down the hours until they were allowed to eat something satisfying. They had the grapefruit and genuinely liked the grapefruit. They had the soup and found it genuinely comforting. They had the one square of chocolate, and it was genuinely enough, in the way that things are enough when you have not spent the whole day building an appetite for excess. The system was not a cage, it was a container, and a well-made container is not a restriction. It is a shape, and having a shape is for most people and most lives a considerable relief. The kitchen table is quiet now. The percolator has been replaced by something sleeker. The grapefruit spoon is in a drawer somewhere, or in a box in the garage, or in the kind of thrift store where the past goes to wait for someone who will recognize it. The habits have scattered. The magazines stopped printing the same diets and started printing different ones. And then the magazines themselves thinned out and disappeared. And now the diets come from somewhere faster and louder and considerably less patient. But the kitchen is still there, and the morning is still there, and the question that the 1960s answered in its quiet, practical, unannounced way is still exactly the same question it has always been. What do you do with the day you have been given? How do you live in the body you are living in? The women at that table already knew. They had known for years. They just never made a fuss about it. It is 6:50 in the morning, and the kitchen is already in motion. The children need lunches assembled. The coffee needs pouring. Someone has misplaced a shoe, and the school bus does not wait for anyone's opinion on the matter. In the middle of all of this, the woman of the house is eating breakfast. The word eating is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because what is actually happening is closer to consuming things vertically in transit between tasks, with one hand occupied and the other doing something else entirely. A piece of toast broken in half and eaten in 2 bites over the sink. Half a banana left on the counter from yesterday. A spoonful of something taken directly from a bowl meant for a child who has not yet come downstairs. This was breakfast for a great many women in the 1960s, and it was quietly, and without anyone documenting it, one of the most calorie-efficient meals of the day. The standing breakfast was not a philosophy. It was a consequence of circumstance. The morning in a household with children and a husband departing for work was a logistical operation that left very little room for the kind of seated, attentive meal that the nutrition advice of the era recommended. Women who had read the magazine article about the importance of a proper breakfast, and the women who had not behaved identically at 6:50 in the morning, because the magazine article was written by someone who had not been in that kitchen at that hour. What the standing breakfast produced in caloric terms was a modest and incidental morning intake that bore no resemblance to the sit-down meal it was theoretically supposed to be. The half piece of toast carried perhaps 50 calories. The half banana carried around 50 more. The spoonful from the child's bowl added perhaps 30. The total was a fraction of what a proper breakfast would have amounted to, and it was consumed without the pleasure or the attention that makes eating feel like eating, which meant the appetite did not register it as fully as it might have registered something eaten slowly at a table. The body was fed just enough to function through the morning without triggering the kind of satisfied fullness that a larger meal would have produced. There is a reasonable argument that this was not ideal in nutritional terms, that the distracted vertical between task breakfast was an impoverished version of what morning eating could and should be. That argument is probably correct. And yet the practical outcome, in terms of the daily caloric ledger, was a morning that began lightly and built slowly, leaving the appetite in a state of moderate, manageable readiness for the light lunch that was coming, rather than the state of post-breakfast satiation that collapses back into hunger by 10 o'clock. The children ate first, and ate properly, with bowls of cereal or eggs or oatmeal and a glass of juice at the table, because the children needed the fuel, and the children were the priority. This ordering was not discussed or decided. It was simply the way the morning operated, and the woman managing the morning ate around the edges of it. A bite here, a spoonful there, a piece of something finished standing at the counter after everyone else had left. It was not a meal. It was the residue of a meal. And the residue, it turned out, was often enough. Some mornings there was no standing breakfast at all. Just the black coffee drunk in the first moment of quiet after the door closed and the house went still. Those mornings the body ran on coffee and quiet and the particular lightness that comes after the storm of the early morning, and it ran perfectly well. The 1960s body was more patient than we have since given it credit for being. It is a Wednesday evening in October, and the church fellowship hall smells of casserole and coffee cake and the particular combination of a dozen women's cooking arriving in the same room at the same time. The tables are covered in paper tablecloths. The dishes are arranged in the potluck formation that everyone understands, without being told. The mains down one side, the sides across the middle, the desserts at the far end, where they can be surveyed from a distance and anticipated without commitment. And the woman you are watching, the one who made the green bean casserole and brought it in a covered dish wrapped in a dish towel to keep it warm, is now standing at the beginning of the line with a plate, moving through it with an efficiency and a modesty of serving that looks effortless because it has been practiced for years. The church supper, the neighborhood potluck, the school fundraiser dinner. These were regular fixtures of the 1960s social calendar, and they presented a specific challenge to the woman managing her eating with any degree of care. The food was plentiful, cooked by people who were proud of what they had made, and the social expectation was that you ate from it with visible appreciation. Refusing things or taking small amounts that were obviously smaller than the standard portion was a social statement in a context where food was also hospitality. And the women who navigated this regularly had developed a technique that was so practiced it was invisible. The technique was not complicated. You took a small amount of many things rather than a large amount of a few. The plate looked full because it held 8 different items. Each individual item was a modest serving: a spoonful of the green bean casserole, a small scoop of the macaroni salad, a thin slice of the ham, a portion of the dinner roll that was technically half a roll, but presented as though it were a choice rather than a reduction. The overall impression was of someone eating well and enthusiastically. The overall reality was a plate that contained considerably less than it appeared to. This technique, which has since been described in behavioral eating research as variety-based portion management, works in part because the eye reads a full plate as a full meal regardless of the actual quantity present. A plate with 8 small items looks like abundance. A plate with 2 large items of the same total volume looks like excess. The women of the 1960s had not read the behavioral research. They had simply eaten at enough church suppers to know intuitively what the research would later confirm. There was also the matter of the dessert table, which required its own navigation. The desserts at a church supper in the 1960s were serious undertakings: layer cakes with real frosting, pies with hand-crimped crusts, brownies made with butter and real chocolate in quantities that reflected the earnestness of the occasion. You took a slice of something. You did not take 2 things. You sat with your single slice, and you ate it with the full attention it deserved. And that attention, the actual tasting of the thing, the recognition of the specific flavors in it, the brief conversation about who made it and what was in it, made the single slice satisfying in a way that eating 2 things quickly would not have been. The fellowship hall has been renovated since then, or the congregation has moved, or the church supper has been replaced by something more casual and less structured. But the technique survives wherever people who learned it are still going to dinners, with long tables and covered dishes, moving through the line with a plate and a practiced eye and a small, quiet competence that nobody around them particularly notices. That is, of course, the whole point. There is a glass on the kitchen counter. It has been there since morning, filled from the tap and refilled several times over the course of the day, without anyone tracking the number of times or calculating the ounces consumed. It is a plain glass, heavy and clear, the kind that came in a set and has been in the cabinet since the wedding, and it holds water from the kitchen tap that tastes like the local municipality and nothing else. There is no lemon wedge in it. There is no electrolyte packet dissolved into it. It is just water, drunk throughout the day in the ordinary way of someone who is thirsty and who lives near a kitchen. The hydration culture that surrounds water consumption now, the branded bottles, the daily ounce targets, the reminder apps, the wellness content built around the premise that most people are chronically dehydrated and require external prompting to address the fact, would have been completely unintelligible to a woman in a 1960s kitchen. You drank water because you were thirsty. You were thirsty regularly because the work of the day was physical, and the coffee was diuretic, and the house was warm, and the body required replenishment. You drank from the glass on the counter and refilled it and went back to whatever you were doing. This was not a wellness practice. It was just the tap. The appetite-suppressing effect of adequate water consumption was not the reason women in the 1960s drank water throughout the day, but it was an effect nonetheless. Mild dehydration produces a signal that the body sometimes interprets as hunger rather than thirst, and people who mistake this signal and eat in response to it consume calories they did not require for fuel. Women who drank regularly from the glass on the counter were keeping this signal accurate. The body was not confused about what it needed, because what it needed was consistently available. When hunger arrived after the morning's water and the midday glass and the afternoon glass, it was genuine hunger rather than thirst in disguise. The water was drunk with meals and between meals and during the cooking of meals and while doing the laundry and after coming in from the yard and whenever else the glass on the counter made itself apparent. It was drunk at room temperature and at cold temperature depending on the season and the preference and whatever was convenient. It was not ceremonial. It was not aspirational. It was just the background liquid of a day that required liquid, consumed in the ordinary way that things are consumed, when their availability is constant and their cost is essentially nothing, and nobody has yet thought to sell you a superior version of them. The glass on the counter is a small and slightly absurd thing to spend a paragraph on, except that the glass on the counter was always full, and always full meant always available. And always available meant always consumed before the thirst became confusion, and the confusion became a snack that wasn't needed. The 1960s did not optimize this. The 1960s just had a glass on the counter. That was enough. That was, it turns out, quite a lot. There is a version of this available to everyone right now at approximately no cost, requiring no subscription and no equipment beyond what is already in the cabinet. The glass is still there. The tap still works. The body still sends the same signals it was sending in 1963, and it still prefers to have them answered with water before it escalates to something more insistent. The counter is right there. The rest is just refilling. It is dinner time in 1966, and the meatloaf has been sliced and served, and the plate in front of you holds a portion that a present-day restaurant would describe as a side. The slice of meatloaf is perhaps 4 ounces. The mashed potatoes occupy a modest territory on the plate. The green beans, cooked soft with a piece of fatback in the pot the way the era preferred its vegetables, take up the remaining third. The plate is full in the visual sense. The portion, by the standards of what has since become normal in the American eating landscape, is not large. Nobody at the table notices this. Nobody at the table would think to notice it, because this is what a plate of food looks like and has always looked like. And the notion that a plate of food should look different, larger, more loaded, more generous in the way that generosity became confused with volume in the decades that followed, has not arrived yet. The portion sizes of the 1960s were calibrated by cost, by convention, and by the recipes that governed the cooking. A pound of ground beef made a meatloaf that served 6 people. A whole chicken, roasted on Sunday, served 4 at the table and made sandwiches on Monday and soup on Tuesday. The household food budget stretched across the week by treating the primary protein as a resource to be managed rather than a centerpiece to be celebrated at maximum volume. This had the incidental effect of keeping the evening protein portion at a size that the body could process comfortably without the extended digestion and residual heaviness that a 12-ounce steak produces. The research on portion sizes conducted in the decades since has established something that would have seemed obvious to anyone who set a table in 1966, that the amount of food placed in front of a person has a direct and powerful influence on the amount that person consumes, independent of hunger level or nutritional need. People eat what is on the plate. The plate in the 1960s held less. This was not a dietary intervention. It was just the plate. Restaurant meals, eaten occasionally as a genuine treat rather than a regular convenience, were sized similarly to home meals by standards that have since been completely abandoned. The diner portion, the lunch counter portion, the Sunday dinner at the Howard Johnsons on the way back from visiting the relatives. These were real portions, meaning portions calibrated to what the human stomach can comfortably hold, rather than what will make the customer feel they have received adequate value for money. The value through volume logic that now governs most American restaurant portioning had not yet taken hold, and the absence of it meant that eating out did not automatically mean eating twice as much as the body required. The meatloaf on the plate in 1966 did not feel inadequate. It felt like dinner, because it was dinner, and dinner had always been this size, and the size had been decided by practical and economic forces that happened to align with what the body actually needed rather than what the food industry would later persuade people to expect. The plate was sufficient. The evening was complete. Nobody left the table unsatisfied. And the fact that nobody left the table uncomfortable, heavy with excess, lying on the couch at 9 o'clock with the particular regret of someone who ate past the point of sense, that was also part of what the smaller portion was quietly, consistently providing. Not just enough. Exactly enough. It is early evening now, and the day is almost done. The dishes are drying in the rack. The percolator has been rinsed and sits on the stove for tomorrow. The cardigan is back on the hook by the door after the walk around the block. The kitchen is quiet in the way it gets quiet when the work of the day has been completed and the house has settled into its evening self. And the woman who has moved through all of it, the grapefruit and the black coffee, the cottage cheese and the Melba toast, the soup and the walk and the 1 square of chocolate after dinner, is sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of something warm and not particularly thinking about any of it, because none of it required thinking. It was just the day. What she knew, without knowing that she knew it, was the thing that every generation since has spent considerable money and energy trying to rediscover and repackage. She knew that the body responds to consistency over time. She knew that small choices made daily outperform large choices made occasionally. She knew that hunger is not an emergency, and that the answer to hunger is not always food. She knew that movement embedded in a day is worth more than movement scheduled and performed in a designated hour. She knew that pleasure managed thoughtfully is more sustainable than pleasure deferred entirely. She knew all of this not because she had read the research did not yet exist, but because she was living a life with a shape to it, and the shape had been working for long enough that she had stopped examining it and simply inhabited it. The things she did not know are worth acknowledging honestly. She did not know about the cultural pressures that had helped shape her habits, and those pressures were real and not always benign. The expectation that a woman maintain a specific appearance was not neutral, and the anxiety it produced in women who could not or did not conform to it was genuine and harmful. The bathroom scale and the magazine diets and the tab soda were not innocent objects. They were instruments of a culture that had decided what the female body should look like, and the women who lived inside that culture were navigating it with the tools available to them. That navigation produced some habits that were genuinely good for the body. It also produced some things that were not, and it is not honest to take the useful parts without acknowledging what they came packaged in. And yet the habits themselves, separated from the cultural context that produced them, contain something worth retrieving. Not the anxiety, not the expectation, not the narrow ideal that drove the whole apparatus, but the grapefruit, the walk, the 1 square of chocolate, the glass of water on the counter, the soup that was just soup, the plate that was just the plate. These are not ideological positions. They are practical daily arrangements that worked, and they worked because they were simple and consistent and did not require anything from the person practicing them except the willingness to do the same reasonable things in the same reasonable order every day and allow the accumulation to do the rest. The kitchen table is the same table it has always been. The morning is the same morning. The body is the same body, running on the same systems, responding to the same inputs, requiring the same basic management that it has always required. The 1960s woman sat at this table and ate her grapefruit and drank her black coffee and got on with it. And she did not need a name for what she was doing because it did not need a name. It just needed doing. It still does. It always will. And there it is, the whole quiet architecture of it. The grapefruit and the black coffee. The cottage cheese on the plate with the peach half beside it. The Melba toast. The hard-boiled egg wrapped in wax paper at the bottom of the handbag. The soup at noon. The walk after dinner in the amber light. The 1 square of chocolate in the ceramic dish by the percolator. None of it named. None of it celebrated. All of it working every single day in kitchens across America, in the hands and habits of women who were simply living a life with a shape to it and did not need to announce the shape to anyone. What we have been doing tonight is not nostalgia for a simpler time, exactly. The 1960s were not simpler. They were complicated in ways that were specific and serious, and that the women living through them carried without much acknowledgement from the world around them. The pressures were real. The expectations were narrow. The work was immense and mostly invisible. But inside all of that, these women built daily habits that were genuinely, quietly brilliant. Not because they had access to better information than we do, but because they had less noise. Fewer options. A day with more structure and less choice. And it turned out that fewer options and more structure, applied consistently across years, produced something that no app has yet managed to replicate with any reliability. You have been sitting with this for a while now. Maybe you started this video on the couch after dinner, or in the car in a long drive, or lying in bed with the lamp on while the rest of the house went quiet around you. Maybe some of it felt familiar, the glass bowl, the percolator, the smell of soup heating in a small saucepan at noon. Maybe some of it felt like a world you never knew but somehow recognize anyway. The way certain music sounds like a memory even the first time you hear it. Either way, you stayed. And that means something. If this is the first time you have found this channel, welcome. There is more where this came from. More evenings in kitchens that smell of something good. More lives examined slowly and with care. More of the ordinary past treated as the extraordinary thing it actually was. Hit the subscribe button and you will not miss any of it. Hit the like button if tonight felt like time well spent. Leave a comment and tell us something. What your mother kept in that refrigerator. What your grandmother ate for lunch on a Tuesday. What small habit from that era you still carry without knowing quite why you kept it. We read every single one, and they matter more than you know. We are also on Spotify now if you would like to take these stories somewhere quieter. A morning walk, a long drive, an evening when the screen feels like too much and the voice alone is enough. The link is in the description. It will be there whenever you need it. It is late now, or early, or somewhere in the middle of a day that has asked a great deal of you and is finally asking you to stop. The kitchen is quiet. The percolator is cold. Somewhere in a drawer there is a grapefruit spoon with serrated edges that belonged to someone who used it every morning without thinking about it, in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and citrus and the particular calm of a day not yet begun. She knew something. She knew it without knowing she knew it. And now, so do you. Good night.